So yeah, thanks very
Okay,
much.
hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds.
Cool. So our next session is now the PhD scholars who are going to take over. First, we've got a video, which I think, Janae, is that you sharing and ready to go?
That's me.
Yes, cool. Okay, so basically this is going to be a video that Kirstin, Wilmot and Sioux McKenna did for us, which kind of summarizes an article that they published about LCT being used in higher education research, and particularly the uptake in South Africa. And then after that, we're going to have three like short-ish presentations on you know, a doctoral study that is in process. All three of us presenting are basically in our early analysis stages, and we're still kind of figuring out our translation devices and even our focuses and so on. So we'd really like it to be an interactive session where people comment on what we're doing. We're going to show you what we're doing and, you know, pose it to the audience to give us some input. So Janae, when you're ready, you can go ahead.
Okay.
LCT and South African higher education. What's the buzz about? In early 2021, Kirstin, Wilmot and Sioux McKenna got together to explore the uptake of LCT to look at a variety of issues in higher education research in South Africa. What we found was that there has been a general increase in higher education research in response to several drivers, including massification, where we now have a diversified student body and taken for granted practices are increasingly being criticized as ignoring the learning needs of a diverse student body. Parallel to these pressures is the emergence of the idea of the knowledge economy and how this has influenced how universities are understood in society. Increasingly, universities are being seen as a training ground for skilled graduates to contribute en masse to the workforce of the country, rather than as a place for nurturing scholarly individuals who can critically engage with abstract knowledge. Many higher education institutions are trying to respond to the resilience of their colonial heritage. Scholars and students working in higher education are calling for our normalized and common sense practices and ways of being to be scrutinized and transformed so that students achieve more than formal access to university and are also afforded epistemological access. That is, access to principled disciplinary knowledge, as well as the associated dispositions and literacies in ways that do not only privilege a narrow way of knowing and a narrow set of knowledges. Teaching and learning research in South Africa is much the same as elsewhere in the world, in that it is often characterized by atheoretical studies, which are also small scale and which generally fall into the descriptive category of show and tell papers. Without the help of powerful theory, the insights provided by these descriptive studies are often locked into a specific context and as such offer little transformative value for the broader field. Research on higher education tackles an array of topics, but over the last 10 years, scholars internationally and in South Africa have been building an argument that existing research on teaching and learning has overlooked an important consideration: knowledge itself. Scholars point out that a focus on the kind of knowledge students are required to learn has been sidelined in favor of focusing on the structure of the curriculum or the processes of learning, and in effect, knowledge as an object has been neglected, resulting in a curious knowledge blindness. To avoid this dilemma, scholars in recent years have been engaging with issues of teaching and learning using a social realist understanding and adopting a range of analytical tools and substantive theories to consider knowledge and knowledge practices. For example, Bernstein's theory has provided powerful tools for looking at the nature of disciplinary knowledge, as well as the differences between knowledge production, recontextualization, and reproduction. Bernstein's work is particularly useful because it encourages empirical exploration of how education can both replicate and disrupt the social order. And in a post-apartheid South Africa, there has been a particular desire to make sense of the role education plays in reproducing social inequalities. Similarly, the research drawing on new literacy studies has pointed to the different kinds of knowledge practices and associated identities required of students as they become recognized members of different disciplines. While such studies highlight the power of such tacit practices, they do not explain how these practices emerge or why they differ. LCT is able to build on the foundational work of theorists like Bernstein and Bourdieu and take into account the identity focus of new literacy studies. LCT is a theoretical framework offering a conceptual toolkit and analytical methodology that asks the important question: why is it that certain knowledges are legitimated and others are not? And also, how is it that each discipline structures its knowledge and determines the kind of knower deemed worthy of disciplinary membership? It provides a realist understanding that acknowledges the social character of knowledge. To have a look at the relatively quick uptake of LCT in higher education research in South Africa, we got together to have a look at publications from 2010 to 2020. We limited our search to higher education research authored by South African scholars. We only considered chapters in books and peer-reviewed journal articles. We excluded conference presentations and all postgraduate theses, of which there were a great many. Since 2010, there have been 86 peer-reviewed publications by South African authors using LCT to address research issues in higher education, with just 4 publications in 2010, increasing to 19 publications in 2020. What is interesting to note is that the dissemination of knowledge is not limited to a South African audience. Most of the articles were in international journals. The geographical distribution of the research suggests a relevance for a broader readership, and by implication, this shows that this growing body of research can overcome the context-dependent show-and-tell limitations of much past research on teaching and learning. There is clearly a buzz about LCT, and that buzz is global. To illustrate just how useful this theory is, we will now briefly describe 2 LCT dimensions and briefly give an overview of 4 case studies that use these tools. In South African higher education studies, specialization and semantics have been the most used dimensions. In brief, specialization allows us to identify the basis on which any practice is specialized or distinct, and it's premised on the simple notion that everything we do is oriented toward an object and is enacted by a person. So in this sense, all knowledge and practices are said to involve relations to both objects and subjects, and based on this understanding, any analysis of knowledge needs to consider 2 aspects. It needs to consider the relationship to the object of study known as epistemic relations, as well as the relationship between knowledge and the people who are considered legitimate producers or users of that knowledge, known as social relations. Specialization can reveal what is considered legitimate knowledge in any given context at a particular point in time, as well as who can be considered a legitimate knower in any given field. This can give us insights into the often taken for granted aspects of teaching and learning, such as what kind of knowledge is legitimated, what value systems are espoused, the kinds of ideal dispositions students should acquire, and how these aspects shift over time. Several South African scholars have used concepts from specialization to explore a range of issues in teaching and learning. One example is Karen Ellery, who in this 2018 publication looked at a science program at a South African university to understand what was needed to enable success in the discipline. Using these tools, Karen was able to distinguish two different but concurrent learning processes. First, the acquisition of principled scientific knowledge and procedures, and second, a particular kind of disposition or way of being that students needed to embody to gain access to powerful knowledge. By making these two aspects explicit, Karen was able to challenge the dominant view of science as being a collection of neutral facts about the natural world, which students came to know through objective inquiry. And she was able to show that key to student success were the dispositions, values, and literacies a student has to acquire. That is, the social aspects of scientific knowledge. So from a social justice perspective, Karen was able to show how social aspects forms part of the hidden curriculum and could become a gatekeeper to success. Another example of research using specialization was a study by Lct, McKenna, and Harron. They looked at the relationship between industry expectations and the curriculum for public management. They found that the curriculum was focused significantly on knowledge, skills, and processes, with very little attention being paid to cultivating students' dispositions. During apartheid, public administration was focused on controlling citizens and ensuring that various bureaucratic state requirements were effectively managed. In post-apartheid South Africa, there were calls for the public management sector to play a particular role in shifting the callous apartheid system of administration to one focused on service delivery by compassionate and critical individuals. What they study using the specialization tools showed, however, was that while the content of the public management curriculum had changed extensively in the new democracy, the basis of success remained on acquiring a set of fairly technical facts and skills, rather than taking on a disposition of service. So the study showed a code clash between what was valued in the formal curriculum and that which was being demanded by the field. The second dimension of LCT that is used a lot in South African higher education research is semantics, and this dimension offers a different set of tools to reveal the forms that knowledge takes and how this impacts on the basis of success. In brief, semantics explores the context dependence and complexity of practices, and these two concerns are conceptualized as semantic gravity and semantic density. So semantic gravity refers to the degree to which meaning relates only to a particular context, or more broadly. Semantic density, on the other hand, relates to the complexity of meanings. So the stronger the semantic density, the more complex the meanings, typically as a result of condensing many meanings into instances of practice. Scholars have taken up these concepts to explore a range of teaching and learning issues in higher education. For example, it has been proving to be a particularly valuable tool for looking at pedagogic practice and curricula that encourage and enable cumulative learning. And one of its key affordances is that it is able to analyze data at varying levels of detail. So for example, at a meso level, Sharon Clarence in 2016 used these concepts to unpack political science classroom pedagogy. Sharon was then able to use her analysis for staff development by showing lecturers how a central component of constructing arguments in political science is applying theoretical concepts to varying social historical contexts. In effect, what was being required of students was for them to be able to apply theory to real-world examples. Using her analysis, Sharon engaged lecturers in conversation about the kinds of concepts and real-world applications that are valued in their courses and how they could make these more explicit to students. Working at a more micro level, focusing on one assessment task, Ilse Rootman-Lagrange and Max Blackie in 2020 used the semantics tools to analyze a chemistry assessment in an introductory health science course. They were able to show how success in the assessment lay in students' ability to shift between abstract, highly condensed meanings and relatively context-dependent simple meanings. What was really important was that the analysis helped them to understand that the task design was not well suited to assess the learning outcomes. The analysis enabled the authors to better understand the basis of success of the assessment task and offered insights into how such tasks could be more effectively designed in future to encourage the development of cumulative learning. As these snapshots of research illustrate, one of the most coveted aspects of using LCT as a theoretical framework and analytical tool is that it is able to be used at varying degrees of detail to understand knowledge practices. It can also be enacted in any field where there is a need to understand how knowledge works. In South Africa alone, the diversity of application of the theory is considerable, including for higher education research in academic development, African philosophies, biology, chemistry, doctoral writing, engineering, English literature, higher education studies, journalism, marketing, physics, law, supervision practices, science foundation programs, sociology, teacher education, theology, work integrated learning, to name a few. So that's the buzz in the LCT publications we looked at. What's the buzz in yours?
Cool. Thanks so much, Janae. So people are welcome to pop comments about the video that Kirstin and Sioux did for us in the chat. And they've conveniently explained semantics and specialization so that we don't have to do it. So I'm going to hand over to Janae, who's looking at accounting. And thereafter, we'll have a discussion about her paper, after which will be Tanusha. And then and she's looking at pharmacy. And then I'll be looking at English literature in the last presentation. Over to you, Janae.
Okay. Thank you, Retha. Just making sure you can see the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so after that very nice introduction of Kirstin and Sioux, I will now be talking about my PhD study, which is enabling personal and professional development in accounting education, connecting the knowledge with the knowers. So as Retha have started the session, this is really very early work, and most of this presentation is still based on my proposal. I've done some writing since proposal approval started, and I've done a pilot study at the end of last year. So I now need to get on with a good draft of my theoretical chapter and then do my formal data collection. So why this study? And there's two parts to this. So the one part was I moved from corporate, so I was mainly in the mining industry working as an accountant on major mining projects. But I always had this thing that I wanted to help people more to improve their own futures. And then I got the lecturing position, but standing in a classroom full of students as a lecturer, it suddenly just feels for me, I have no idea what I'm doing. How do you actually know that standing in front of the class and teaching, that what you are teaching is what they need to learn and that it's working for them, they're grasping the concepts, they're grasping the calculations. And then how do you assess that to make sure you're actually assessing what you should be assessing? So with all those questions that I've had for myself about my own teaching and my own practices, moved into the higher education field. First did a postgraduate diploma on higher education, which led to my PhD studies in higher education at Rhodes. On the other side then, why the study is just, we're living in a world of rapid change. And I think we all are aware of it, that this world we are in is changing around us. And technology is really playing a big, or has a big impact on the way we live, communicate, learn, and work. And these technological developments really have a big impact on the accounting field as well, as many tasks that previously were done by humans are now being done by computer systems. Your artificial intelligence that's coming in, more software systems that people are starting to use. And the other part of that is also your more mundane, repetitive task that's used to be done by your junior accountants or your entry-level positions are now often being outsourced. So what happens in countries where you have a higher labor cost, those companies will outsource those lower level positions to shared services that's often operated from countries with a lower labor cost. So that is taking away from the job market then. So suddenly students are struggling to find employment because the junior levels are being taken away. And then also it further on also plays an impact as students now, or when people need to move up into more intermediate and senior positions, there's no junior people to take from. So all of these things are impacting on the accounting field. But then we've also seen in recent years all the financial disasters, with the first big one being Enron, which was worldwide, and most people have heard about it. More in South Africa, we've seen the fall of Steinhoff, KPMG, VBS Banking, and all of those were marked by fraudulent transactions and unethical behavior. And unfortunately, somehow accountants were involved. But then also, another aspect is environmental issues. And we have to be more focused on sustainability. So what kind of decisions a company will be making, for example, around something like packaging? Would they use more greener products, more environmental friendly, or do they stick to cheap plastic to make sure they have a higher profit? So all of these are impacting on the business world in which accountants need to work. So how do we then educate accountants? So the focus of my study is on a 3-year diploma in accountancy. And what makes this kind of also tricky or added complexity is that the qualification is not governed by one specific professional body. So our students that we get are often coming in, not necessarily even wanting to study accounting, but due to the fact that it's a diploma with relatively low entry requirements, many students will study it just because they want a university qualification, not necessarily because they want accountants. We then also have quite a few students who actually want to be chartered accountants, but they don't qualify for the chartered accounting route. So they start with the diploma with the idea of moving forward. And so, yeah, we have those two. And then upon completion of the qualification, students can then articulate into a postgraduate qualification, or they can apply for membership at a number of professional bodies, specific in South Africa, as well as international bodies like the Chartered Institute of Management Accounting and the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. And through these, their membership and then the structures within the professional bodies, they can further their studies and still become professional accountants. Or many students who will just complete the diploma and they will go on to be accounting technicians in your small and medium enterprise businesses. So in terms of this aim of my study is to give insights into how the pedagogy in a knowledge-driven vocational field like accounting can be transformed to assist students to become knowledgeable and professionally capable accountants. And to do this, I will ask 3 questions. So first, what knowledge is legitimated in the accounting curriculum? What kind of knower is valued and legitimated in the current curriculum? And how is the current curriculum enacting or constraining knowledge and knower building? So this is not the first study in accounting education using LCT. From what I'm aware, there's been 3 PhD studies so far. McPherson completed her PhD in 2014, and she focused on how professional accounting practices represented in a university classroom discourse and what are the implications for this theory and practice in professional learning. She focused on a Masters of Accounting program. McKenna in 2015 completed her PhD, and she was looking at understanding the knowledge and knowledge structures in the Certificate of the Theory of Accounting. That is the fourth year level for students doing chartered accounting in South Africa. So she used the Bernstein's pedagogical device and specialization. Libba, who just recently completed her PhD last year, also used Bernstein's pedagogical device and specialization to investigate the problem of curriculum change in accounting. And the participants in her study were early career professional accountants. And then there's been one master study by Myers. She completed it in 2013. And interestingly enough, she was so far the only one who published papers from her study. So in the 2016 paper, she focused on how hierarchical knowledge structure of accounting impacts in teaching and learning of a first semester introductory accounting course. And in the second paper, she then focused on how students constructed knowledge during lectures, tutorials, and self-study periods. And it provides a theoretical explanation of why some methods of constructing knowledge are more effective than others. So my study really builds onto the work of Myers, as I'm looking more at the pedagogy and how that is designed and then enacted to enable cumulative knowledge building, whereas Myers in her study looked at what the students did. So for my study, I will draw on specialization, and the focus with specialization is to explore how lecturers can be more conscious about ensuring students gain access to both the legitimated knowledge and the desired dispositions through their pedagogies. The knowledges and knowers that the discipline legitimates must be better contextualized and made more visible in our pedagogy. At the same time, our pedagogy needs to be formed around who the students are. This does not mean that the discipline or module will necessarily change from a knowledge code to a knower code. What it does mean is that we need to find ways to make the required dispositions of the knower more explicit while we focus on the relevant principled accounting knowledge. And a better understanding of this relationship between knowledge knowing and knowers will help lecturers to be better equipped for the teaching, learning, and assessment challenges that they are facing in a diverse and complex educational context. So the epistemic relations and social relations will help me to understand the knowledge practices of the field, and this level of analysis will help to answer the research question on what knowledges and kinds of knowers are legitimated in the vocational accounting qualification. Then moving to semantics, I will use semantics at a broad level, as this will be useful when looking at how the content of a specific module is taught, explained, and simplified for the students to gain a good understanding and for cumulative knowledge building to take place. So the concern is that lecturers might unintentionally be using high or low semantic flatlines or even escalators. And with this, I'm not saying that flatlines or escalators is always bad, but it could have a negative impact on the students' learning and then cumulative knowledge building, as they might struggle to apply concepts in different contexts. And I think we often find that as we are explaining concepts to the students, we are doing it with examples that we as lecturers are coming up with. And if the students are not understanding that example, either the language or the context of the example, it could mean that they are struggling to understand the concepts and calculations we are trying to explain to them, leading them to either a high or low flatline or even escalators. So it is important for lecturers to understand the student body and be able to use examples that the students can associate with and make sure that they are understanding these. So then through the use of semantics, it will be possible to establish how the current curriculum is taught and how the students are experiencing the teaching, as this will help to determine if the current curriculum is enacting or not enacting the knowledge and ways of knowing, acting, and being that is legitimated in the vocational accounting curriculum. Okay. So yeah, that's in brief my study. And I think maybe while I'm in this position and having everybody here, at the moment, the one thing that I'm grappling with is what impact, or I need to determine which modules do I focus on first year, second, or third year modules when I do my data collection. Will it really impact on the study? And how important is that selection of specific modules for my study and data collection?
Cool, thanks so much, Janae. So does anyone have any comments for Janae or advice? You're also welcome to pop things into the chat.
Hi, Janae. Just more to say, thanks. It looks really interesting. Looks really great.
Thank you.
Oh, not at all.
I was thinking about what Karen said in the previous session about the axiology, you know, and how it could be applicable to the STEM disciplines. And yeah, I just thought that was a nice tie-in with what you were talking about as well. Natalie, would you like to come in?
Hi, yes, hi, Janae. I just wanted to say brilliant work that you're doing, research in the field of accounting. And I think it's really important.
Are you also
we don't always accounting practical social relations in different contexts. It's going to be really valuable to the accounting field.
Thank you.
So we'll also have an opportunity for more discussion at the end of the session. Janae, is there anything you'd like to respond to or elaborate on before we move to Tanusha?
No, I mean, I can just mention that Natalie is also busy with her PhD in accounting. And then I know of at least 2 others in South Africa that's using LCT4 PhD or accounting education PhD studies. So it's actually interesting how it's starting to take off in the accounting field as well. And then, yeah, that social relation and axiological analysis is there, but I'm trying to use as much theory as the problem demands. So there's some stuff that once I have my data and I start with analysis might come into the study. At this stage, I'm trying to control myself.
I know the feeling. Tanusha, are you ready to present?
Yeah, all good. Can you see my screen?
I can use, oh, there we go. You're on presenter mode now.
Perfect. Okay, a big South African how's it to everyone. Before I tell you about my PhD, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about who I am. So I am a lecturer at Rhodes University. I am an early career academic, and all that means is that I've just recently entered the world of academia. Prior to this, I have been studying to become and training to become a physiologist. So physiology is classified as a basic science. And what that means is that it is a specialized body of knowledge that holds fundamental facts that anyone who wants to understand the human body needs to know. These facts are centered around function. So if you look at our nice little heart on the side here, a physiologist is interested in what makes this heart beat, how it keeps that rhythm, how does it create that pressure that sends blood throughout your body. So we talk about function, we talk about mechanisms. So the molecular, the electrochemical pathways that allow the body to function, that's the interest for us. We also talk about homeostasis. So homeostasis is the body's incredible way of keeping everything in a perfect balance, no matter what you're doing. So if you are sitting down, or if you're sleeping, or if you're running a marathon, in all three cases, your heart is still able to pump blood. It is still able to get blood to every single tissue in your body. So we talk about homeostasis as well. Now, when I entered into academia, we had three big conversations that were happening. One was between the academics, so those who are scientists versus those who are clinicians. And the question was, where does basic science knowledge fit into a clinical curriculum? The other conversation was between students and academics. And the loudest thing that they were asking was, why do I need to know all of these intricate facts, all of this content-laden information? How does that help me become a doctor or nurse or a pharmacist? And a very whisper of a conversation started happening as well, which is about access to knowledge. And this conversation was made a little bit louder by Karen Ellery, who used LCT to show that the knower's role actually plays a big part in access to knowledge. And as we've heard throughout the conference, other people are contributing to this conversation as well. So all of their work and her work is a good example of how we can use LCT to get into these conversations. So if we actually defined what is valid, legitimate knowledge for clinical curricula, we can then see where the basic knowledge fits in. If we define what a knower is for our course, we can tell students, this is how it's relevant, this is what it's training you to be. So in essence, my PhD project is doing exactly that. I'm looking at the course that I teach, which is Human Anatomy and Physiology, and I teach it to pharmacy students, so it's in the pharmacy degree. I'm trying to figure out what is the key, what is the valid information that they need to know, and who are the knowers for this particular course. So in this course, what we have is three specialized bodies of knowledge that have been packed into the course. We have anatomy, which is about structure, location, relation. So if you look at the heart again, an anatomist is interested in the cells that build up this heart. They're interested in where the heart sits in the body, where does it sit in location to other structures like the lungs, and how does that help it perform its function? Physiologists, again, will look at the function, the mechanisms, and how the heart is able to maintain homeostasis. But pharmacists, on the other hand, as a profession, they have a wider scope of practice. So they're looking at things like the pharmaceutical manufacturing of medication and how that affects the body, the pharmaceutical care of patients. So how is treatment helping them maintain an optimal function for their body? They're looking at things like pharmaceutical supply. How can we get these things to people who need them? So their scope of practice is very wide, and they need to know how the body is structured. They need to know what makes the body up. They need to know how the body functions so that they can be perfect at the jobs that they do. So my three questions are, for the course that I teach, which is Human Anatomy and Physiology, what is the basis of achievement for this course? Does it help develop the student as a future pharmacist? When we look at the people who are involved in the curriculum, how are they interpreting the Human Anatomy and Physiology curriculum? What I did was I started to code, so I'm just in my very initial stages of data collection, and I've looked at different documents, and I've tried to just categorize it according to whether this in the document speaks to epistemic relations. Is it part of anatomy? Is it part of physiology? Is it part of pharmacy? And I plan to do the same with social relations, looking at dispositions from the three aspects. But two things happened this week. One is my supervisor, Dr. Carmen Altman, looked at the slide, looked at the presentation that I was going to present to you, and said, "You're explaining this well, but you are oversimplifying things. You have homogenized all of these disciplines, and profession. And what she's alluding to is that even though anatomy on its own is a discipline, has a profession, physiology on its own is a discipline, has a profession, in this context, it is only subjects within a whole pharmacy degree. And Chrissy Bowie actually made it a little bit more clearer using Bernsteinian terms in saying that pharmacy is a region that looks outwards towards the field of practice and looks inwards towards singulars. In this case, it is disciplines, and two of which is anatomy and physiology. So rethinking what I'm doing, I'm actually questioning if I'm doing the right thing. Am I putting all of them on the same plane and equating all of their knowledge together so that I can compare them and find the basis of achievements from there? Or should I be looking at epistemic relations in terms of theoretical anatomy and physiology knowledge, i.e. the facts from these disciplines versus the application of these facts in pharmacy? Or, and if I look at this, the question is, what is the basis of achievement? If I look at semantics, if I look at specialization, sorry, all I'm going to know is if there is code clashes or if there is movement in the codes. So taking this into consideration, the fact that pharmacy is a region and anatomy and physiology is disciplines, and taking into consideration everything that has been said, including Prof. Jacobs' presentation, where it was emphasized that students who are going to go into healthcare need to know how to be the knower. And taking into consideration South Africa's regulatory body, which is the South African Pharmacy Council, their requirements, and their requirement is that the graduate needs to be able to integrate and apply information from these disciplines. If we take all of that together, should I really be looking at the basis of achievement and asking what it is for this course? Or should I be accepting that the basis of achievement actually should be what is important to a pharmacist in terms of the knowledge and how we are helping to train them to become pharmacists? So am I actually using the right tool here? Have we moved beyond this question of what is the basis of achievement in this field? So I'm going to take advantage of this very international platform, and I'm going to ask, am I actually defining my epistemic relations correctly for these three types of knowledge, for the question that I'm asking? And am I actually asking the right question in this current day? And am I then using the right tool to answer that question?
Cool, thanks so much, Tanusha. So some behind the scenes, Tanusha and I were still sitting last night and looking at this, and that's when we decided that maybe she should actually be using autonomy instead of just ER and SR to look at her data. So yeah, this is a great chance to get some input from people, and I see Karen, your hand is up, so please jump in.
Tanusha, my heart is happy to hear about another regional study. I just wanted to say, I think the big thing, sorry, you're sitting on a screen over there, which is why I'm looking sideways. I've got 3 screens in front of me here. You've hit exactly the same problem I had when I was looking at engineering, and engineering from the context of, at that stage, from a UOT position, it was very much applied, technical in that space, no question. But with the shift in South Africa being far more theoretical, knowledge-based, etc., and now working at Stellenbosch, where the focus is very much like your anatomy and physiology and the fundamental, what we call sciences, versus the applied pharmacy in the world of work. And I had also started with, in my master's, I used semantics to try and flesh out at different stages how practitioners draw on these different kinds of knowledges. And in my master's already, I had, like you looking at the curriculum, when I watched them in practice over project work over time, I could separate out the different degrees of condensation of meaning, or the different degrees of context independence between physics and mechanics and electrical and computing over time. But it wasn't enough. And for the PhD then, I realized I went back to Bernstein, and I, as Chrissy has pointed out to you, I said, okay, this is a region, but it's so strongly bounded by some of these fundamental singulars, but how do those singulars work? And when do they work? So it took me into the knowledge, into the epistemic relations, to the epistemic plane. Okay, I had a different objective, but it might be worth your while just to look at some of that. I'll maybe put I'll pop you a YouTube link in here just to look at. I've got a short YouTube video, just so you can see the relationship between the Bernsteinian stuff, you know, separating out these different hierarchical knowledge structures, the different singulars, and how they come together and are applied in practice over time. It might just jog your head, you know, it might give you something else to think about, because you face exactly the same problem. It's a region and it has all these complexities, and you have to end up simplifying far too radically on the specialization plane to look at what the basis of achievement is.
Yeah.
So just as I'll pop a link into the thing that you might just find useful to go, maybe I should think about this.
Okay, thank you so much.
Awesome. Sharon, did you want to add to that, or is Karen the final authority?
Karen is the authority on the 4K model, especially when it comes to the epistemic plane. I'm not even going to pretend to try and be as knowledgeable as Karen on this. But yeah, I just also want to echo what Janae said. These questions are good questions, Tanusha, and they will help you. I mean, autonomy, and I'm very limited on my understanding of autonomy, but that's really how Carl's kind of developed out Bernstein's rather limited work on regions and singulars. So if it's really a question about the region and singular bit and how those relate to one another, then maybe autonomy is useful. But if it's more about what is the knowledge and what is it oriented to and what are the expectations, then I would really strongly recommend looking at the epistemic plane in the 4K model and try and sort of going a little bit down that road, because it sounded to me like you were asking a 4K kind of question rather than an autonomy kind of question. But yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Cool. So how we were thinking about it last night was that we were thinking of like the target, the kind of target knowledge in terms of what you need to know in order to be a pharmacist. And then we were thinking about the relational autonomy as, you know, has that knowledge been linked up to the practice of being a pharmacist? So it's about that, you know, can you draw on the information in the situation where you're going to need it? But I'm not sure, because, you know, like Tanusha and I are also not like super, we haven't really looked at autonomy that much. It just occurred last night. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on whether that makes sense or not. Thanks, Karen, for that. Cool. And I think, Tanusha, maybe Karen's going to be your new best friend.
Absolutely.
Karen.
In fact, what I'm going to do then is I'll put a link to my playlist in here. Any of you, you're welcome. These are open and public. Because I actually do get so nervous before public presentations like this, believe it or not. I prepare, and then I realized I already have this recording. I might as well just upload it. It's there, you know, before I actually present at conferences. So I'll put a playlist link in here, and you'll see a lot of the tools being used there.
Thank you.
Cool.
Okay, so if there's nothing else, Tanusha, anything more from your side?
No, just thank you so much. Oops. Thank you so much for all of the encouragement and for all of your advice. It actually really helps to plan my next steps for my PhD. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Tanusha. Okay, so I'm going to then move on to mine, and please tell me if this is working. Is that working? I can't see you guys.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Right, so so my study looks at English literature, also looking at a curriculum, and yeah, I have a lot of data. I'm looking at 3 years of my of the curriculum, and I'm still struggling to figure out, you know, what the most important things are for me to focus on. But I'm going to show you something that I've done using specialization. And because I'm looking at, oh, I should also add, I'm actually a lecturer at UNISA, University of South Africa. So I'm looking at the UNISA English literature curriculum. And yeah, I'm looking at the moment at lenses because I'm looking at different modules that are all part of the same curriculum. I'm looking at curriculum alignment to try and, you know, see whether we have curriculum alignment or not. And because all of these modules are part of the same discipline in the same department, I thought that it might be useful to kind of get into a really fine-grained analysis to see what's going on there. Our students a lot of our students really struggle with our English literature modules. In fact, we've been branded as the, you know, barrier modules and things like that, because a lot of education students actually have to take our English first year modules to complete their degrees, and they kind of, a lot of them end up taking our module, you know, taking their education degree up to 4th year, completing all of their education modules, but they're still sitting on this first year English module, and they just can't pass. And I can say from personal experience, it's not from, you know, lack of trying or lack of caring on the part of the lecturers in the English department. So yeah, that's what kind of started the, you know, study, and made me think about what is it, maybe, you know, in terms of the different kind of expectations, the different literacy practices that we expect, that might be, you know, stumbling blocks for students, and what can we do to open that up so that we create epistemological access. So here are my research questions. The first one is, what kinds of knowledge and knowers are legitimated in the UNISA undergraduate English literature curriculum? And then the second one is, does the literature curriculum at UNISA enable epistemological access to the discipline? And I've gone back and forth on this second question to think about whether I should be looking at epistemic access and epistemic justice separately, you know, the decolonial question, or whether they should, you know, whether that's beyond the scope of the study, but that's still kind of in flux at the moment. So yeah, basically what I'm doing, the rationale is that I'm trying to investigate the tacit norms underlying English literary studies in our department, and to try and render those implicit values explicit so that we can teach the practices more overtly, and also so that we can critique them, you know, and really see what it is that we're expecting from students. In my PhD, I'm planning to draw on both specialization and semantics to answer my research questions. Specialization to look at the extent to which there's coherence in the curriculum, and also possible, you know, code clashes between students and, you know, lecture expectations and so forth. And then semantics to look at like cumulative knowledge building and whether we're achieving success in that regard. And I'm particularly interested in looking at 3 years of the curriculum because English literary studies has been coded in previous studies as a cultivated gaze discipline. which means that, you know, the disposition of the student is valued, and that it develops by immersion within that discipline. So I think that looking at 3 years of data will allow me to kind of see if there's a developmental trajectory between the 3 years in terms of developing that gaze. So I'm just going to focus on how I'm using specialization in my study for this talk, and show you how I've taken it down to the level of lenses, first gazes and then to lenses. But the idea is to use specialization to like plot different practices within the curriculum, as well as student dispositions on the specialization plane, and then also on the social relations plane, and to see whether we are getting like one strong dominant code, or whether we getting a lot of fragmentation to see, you know, if there's a lot of mixed messages in terms of what is actually valued in English literature studies. And I've got data from lecture interviews, as well as student interviews, which I'll be using to look at lecturer, you know, what lecturers say they value and what students understand about what is valued in the curriculum, or, you know, the dispositions that they came in with from school and whether those are different. And I'm looking at the curriculum as well of the different modules, as well as pedagogy and assessment, to try and see whether we've got some alignment between what we expect, how we then teach, and whether our assessment is actually assessing the things that we are valuing within the discipline. And yeah, as I've already said, I'll be using gazes and lenses to get into this specialization on a deeper level, because I'm looking at modules within the same curriculum. So this has also been somewhat covered in what I've said earlier, but it's about what previous studies have said about English literature. And as you can see, there's quite a few studies that have been done. And most or all of them have found that that English literature tends to value a stronger social relations. So a specific kind of disposition or gaze needs to be developed in the student, and have also identified that gaze as a cultivated gaze. So that means that this disposition can be built up through immersion within the discipline, whether it be immersion in literary texts or in the scholarship on literary texts, that this is not something that you have to belong to, you know, a specific social category or biological category, but it is something that can be cultivated over time. Now, of course, my study might not have the same findings because the discipline is practiced differently in different contexts. But my initial data analysis, and as I said, I'm still in the early phases of this data analysis, but my early findings seem to suggest that we are also talking about stronger social relations in my data and a cultivated gaze. So just for those who are not so familiar with gazes and lenses, I think we've kind of done a decent job of talking about epistemic and social relations within specialization. But within stronger social relations, you've got these two different kinds of relations, which are subjective relations and interactional relations. And stronger subjective relations mean that the social biological category that you belong to is important in order to be considered a legitimate knower within that field. So perhaps it is, you have to be a member of the LGBTQ community to be considered a legitimate speaker within a specific social context. And that's something that is not so much cultivated as, part of who you are. Then we've got interactional relations, which have more to do with a specific disposition that is valued that can be shaped by immersion. And this would be, for example, immersion in like works of art, you know, in my case, literary texts, or it could be in the scholarship, you know, within the discipline and so forth. And then if we go to the level of lenses, now what I've done here is, because I've seen that I've got the cultivated gaze, seems to be the dominant gaze within what is valued in my data. Within the cultivated gaze, you can then further distinguish between two different kinds of lenses. And this is the ontic lens, so cultivated gaze with ontic lensing, and cultivated gaze with discursive lensing. Ontic lensing is where significant others within the field are construed as objects of study. So what that means is, for example, if your object of study is the literary text, and you believe that immersion, like reading all of these wonderful canonical works, perhaps, you know, is what's going to give you the sensibilities in order to judge what is valuable and what is good writing, good literary writing, then you'd be dealing with an ontic lens, which is being cultivated through immersion in those works of art. While with the discursive lens, this is where we are looking at studies of the object of study as the main thing that you need to immerse yourself in order to develop the valued gaze. So this would, for example, be like with English literature, it would be the scholarship on, you know, the literary criticism that you need to immerse yourself in order to pick up the gaze that you need to be applying to literary texts. But we would then be saying that the text itself, you know, is not as important as the gaze that you find in the scholarship that you need to then take to the text in order to show your legitimate gaze. Right. So what I've got here is 3 quotes from lecturer interviews. And what I found when I, you know, started coding it and went down to the level of lenses is that it seems that we've got cultivated gaze in all 3 of the examples that I'm going to show you, but that we've got different lenses. And I'd like to show you these 3 quotes and to, you know, show you how I've coded them as a way of kind of checking if you agree with what, you know, how I've coded. So it's a form of like kind of almost testing out my translation device. And about, you know, what you think about what my way forward is using what I've learned here from looking at the interviews. So the first quote I've labeled it as talking about transformative education. And this lecturer said in an interview, I think studying literature allows you to step into the shoes of other people from other periods, from other cultures. And it allows you to see things from their perspective. And that is one of the most important ways in which we teach empathy, kindness, understanding, tolerance, etc. Right, so this I've coded as stronger social relations, stronger cultivated gaze, because here the idea is that you need to be immersed in these literary works in order to start seeing the world from other people's perspectives than your own. So it's through immersion in literary works that represent these other cultures and other periods and perspectives that this gaze, this disposition of empathy, kindness, understanding, and tolerance is supposed to be developed. And because immersion in the text, and in this case, it would be text probably chosen for the purposes of displaying these different kinds of cultures and perspectives, because immersion within that is what's supposed to, you know, teach this disposition. This I have coded as an ontic lens. But interestingly, it's not the kind of ontic lens that you find in the like I know in Cole's article about British cultural studies, he talks about, you know, the canon and immersion in this, you know, considered to be like highbrow works of art, is what developed a certain gaze and what was valued within British cultural studies at some point in its history. But here it's more about exposing students to texts that, you know, highlight these different cultural perspectives instead of, you know, something that's considered aesthetically to belong to the canon. So that's my first one. Then my next one is what I've labeled as reading through a theoretical lens. And this lecturer, when I interviewed him, he was actually talking about his own experiences as a PhD student and the advice he got from a colleague who was more experienced in using literary theory. And the quote says, "And he said, you must read it and read it and read it and read it. And luckily with my PhD, I had a year just to go and read theory. He said to me, then you'll be amazed how much sticks in your mind and how then you start to think like that. You start to look at a text like that. You start to employ those theoretical principles, but in a very organic sort of way. You are no longer imposing the theory on the text. And that's the very, very difficult thing to teach. But I think it's that maximum exposure." So why I've coded this one as cultivated gaze is that while this is theoretical knowledge that the student needs to immerse themselves in, it is described as a process of immersion through which you develop this theoretical way of looking at the literary text. So it's not like this is your theory and this is how you apply it. The lecturer makes a strong point about the fact that these theoretical principles need to be applied in an organic sort of way. So it's like more by feel, by having immersed yourself so long in that theory that you now read the world through that lens, or the text that is being valued here. And what I've also coded it as is discursive lensing, because here we're talking about a theory, a literary theory. So it's scholarship about the literary artifact rather than the literary text itself that is cultivating the gaze that is valued in the student. Okay, so then my last example. Here I've got, I've put this one as close reading, a way of engaging with the text. Now, if you speak to English literature lecturers, like one of the first things they usually tell you when you talk about what it is that they're trying to teach students, close reading is one of the things that they mention. And in this quote, the academic said, in an ODL environment, so this is online distance learning environment, it is a very difficult thing to teach. I think if you're in a classroom, you can have up your slides up and you can demonstrate what close reading is. I think it's a far, far more difficult thing to demonstrate in the study guide. We certainly do that with the first year module, but this is just the kind of thing where students need to learn by seeing someone do it and repeating. A lot of it is literally just repeating the same exercise over and over again. So again, here I've coded as cultivated because it's through exposure to this lecturer who is demonstrating how to engage with the literary text that the student is supposed to kind of pick up on how, how they're supposed to engage with the text. And it's something that needs to be demonstrated to the student. It's not like a set of steps that you can give them and then they'll be able to do it if they studied the steps correctly. But interestingly, so I've also coded this as discursive lens because this is a scholar of literary texts that they are watching, performing this literary analysis. So it's not the text itself, it's the the scholarship of the text. But in this case, we've got a different kind of basis, which is the kind of way of engaging with a text which is being modeled, a way of reading a text which is being modeled. It's not a theoretical lens. Like, the theoretical lens is actually interchangeable. What is valued is that there's a certain, way in which you need to read a literary text regardless of the theoretical lens that you're using. So I've also labeled this as discursive lens, but it seems to me to be a different kind of discursive lens that is valued here to what was valued in the theory quote that I showed you. So what is the point of all of this that I showed you? Of course, I'd love your input on, whether you agree with my coding and whether you kind of, it makes sense to you. But my conclusion is that we've got these examples of cultivated gaze in each case, but there's still something different that is actually being legitimated. And what I'd like to do to take this further is to then ask questions of the curriculum and the modules to say, okay, but are these gazes all, so in a way similar to what Mandy was talking about in her presentation earlier, are all of these things equally important? Do students understand how they interact with each other? Or are we sending students mixed messages in different modules, depending on which lecturer, emphasizes which aspect of this literary gaze, if you can call it that? And then I'd like to look at how this plays out in assessment. I mean, especially that first quote that I showed you about, the more transformative education thing. Is that even something that should be assessed? And ultimately, the question then is there a clear trajectory in terms of the gaze that's being developed over this curriculum of 3 years, or are we dealing with segmented learning? And does the pedagogy and assessment help to facilitate the development of the valued gaze? So that is me. Thanks very much, everyone. And those are my references. So yeah, I'd very much appreciate your input. I'm just going to stop sharing here.
I think Carol's question is quite an interesting one. Do you have a sense of the reading competences that students have when they enter the module? I don't know. Carol.
Yeah, thanks, Retha. I was just, sorry, I can't comment on the lenses and stuff. That's, I don't have that knowledge, but I'm just thinking about the actual students that, I mean, everything we know about South African students, well, South Africans generally, is they don't read. And not only don't they read, but often they cannot read. So that's, I guess, is my question, is what is the reading competence? Do you have a sense of the actual reading competence that students come in with? You were talking about students' dispositions, but I'm wondering if here it's both the disposition to want to read, obviously, which we know most South Africans don't have, but also the actual ability to read those texts, the level of those texts, because you're actually asking them to do two things. First, to read literary texts and then to engage in critical analysis of those texts. But I'm wondering if students can't even do the first thing at all. So anyway, it's just a question about whether you have actually tested students' reading competences, and if that would be an additional data source that might be of use, that it's not necessarily about, all the clashes and whatever, but simply, well, not simply, but one of the issues is that students are not actually able to read the texts that you're asking them to read.
Thanks for that, Carol. That's a definite factor. So at UNISA, they don't do like formal literacy tests or anything, but this is one of the major issues that lecturers complain about is how are we supposed to teach students these close reading skills, like trying to teach them to read for the deeper meaning when their literacy levels are not, at the right level. And a lot of them actually say, students should actually have a gap year, like a bridging year, where they are first taught, the, literacy practices before they even start with their curriculum. So I like it. Thanks, Daniel. I'd like your input on this, because from what I've seen in the, the research on academic literacies, it seems to me that the best thing to do is actually that these things should be built at the same time, that this, reading competency should be built at the same time as within the discipline, because these academic literacies are so different depending on which discipline you're working with, and that these are not generic skills, So yeah, my thoughts, sorry, this is coming out as a bit of a ramble, but I am thinking about whether it can be possible to teach students these deeper levels of, reading for meaning at the same time as we are going through the first year curriculum. I don't know if that made sense, Carol.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. I think it's just, yeah, it's a real challenge, because if you don't have any competent, or your reading competence is so low that it's really just at a kind of decoding level, which is what, all the literature shows in schooling, that's what's happening. And I think there's also a huge gap between students who take English first additional language or English home language, have very different levels of achievement and legitimation in terms of how you actually deal with literature, or if you deal with literature at all. So I think it's a really tough one, because you're trying to inculcate a kind of literate gaze where students in fact have probably minimal literacy at all.
Yeah. Something that is interesting, and this is very specific to UNISA, I think, but is like these students are managing to pass their fourth year education modules, while still being stuck on this literature course. And I realized that the education modules, from the interviews I've done, it seems that that there's a lot less writing in the education modules, that it's short answers and multiple choice, and that we want something quite different. But there is a literacy level that is, at least able to decode at that level for them to be able to finish up to fourth year at, UNISA's education curriculum. So there must be something in terms of the academic literacies that are different, that is causing some of the problems for us in the English literature courses.
I guess what I was just saying, it might be interesting to not only look at students' dispositions, but to actually look at their knowledge.
Yeah, I hear
which maybe you're doing, but you didn't kind of mention that in the study. Yeah. But thanks.
Cool,
very
thank you. Daniel, would you like to come in? I see you have some comments in the chat.
Well, just sort of talking about the literacy challenges that you may be facing as well, and coming from the SFL background that's got this very strong sort of approach to genre pedagogy and the teaching and learning cycle with the stages of deconstruction of texts and really getting into the meaning of it and guiding students through it. It is, as I say, it is very helpful, but it's very, very time consuming. And where do you find the space in curriculum that's got this, and as I sort of said, arguably creates you're bringing in another field of knowledge, another area of knowledge, and it can be very hard to sort of reconcile the two. And how do you integrate that into a pre-existing curriculum that's got its own needs as well? So, it's not necessarily just it's not the silver bullet that we might hope for, because it just creates a whole lot of other issues as well. But that's just something that always pops to mind for me.
It was very interesting to me in the was it Chris Will's talk yesterday, that there was discussion about like the teachers who the CAPS curriculum, and how it doesn't enable teachers to learn how to teach students to read for meaning, that there's actually very, very little there. And, my colleagues will often say, we're not supposed to teach our students that teachers know how to do that. Academics don't know how to do that. But, from what was said yesterday, it seems like there's also like teachers are also not so clear, at least in South Africa, on what exactly that means and how we're supposed to do that. So it seems like everybody thinks it's somebody else's job.
Oh yeah, I guess so. Like I've been very lucky in some of the positions. I'm going to limit it. I'm going to say I've had 2 positions where I've had opportunities to work with the experts, and this is where we worked alongside each other. So I've worked with a content expert, and coming with my linguistic knowledge, I kind of had a little bit of freedom and autonomy to actually say, okay, I'm going to bring in these SFL approaches, and I'm going to use LCT as these lenses, but I could very rarely actually use it explicitly. 1, because it just created boundaries, and 2, it was just too much. I didn't need those. The teachers didn't need to know that. So I used it for my own insight, and I was lucky enough to be able to create the materials that were student facing for the academics to deliver. So through the collaboration, and I think I've seen calls for that in a lot of EAP papers. We need more time for collaboration between people with these ability and these skills with deconstructing texts. They don't necessarily need to be the ones teaching it. But they need to help, the academics, and basically help them with the materials, but collaboratively.
Yeah, that also makes me think of like what Lee was saying yesterday about with teacher education, how the curriculum is often very fragmented, and the different modules and things, people responsible for different things not talking to each other. And at UNISA, I know that all universities don't do it like that, but I know University of Pretoria and University of South Africa have this thing where the disciplinary experts are supposed to teach the discipline knowledge, and then the education departments are supposed to teach how to teach. And those things are completely like, our lecturers don't have the vaguest idea what is happening in the education curriculum. And definitely the education people, they're just very annoyed with us, because their students are failing, but they, also have no understanding of what it actually is that we're trying to do and to cultivate and stuff. So that's, that same kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of relationship between the academic developer, the EAP, person, working with a lecturer, we also need that kind of integration with our disciplines. Lee, I see your camera's on. Would you like to come in?
Oh no, I'm just having a listen. That's exactly right, Retha, and it makes it's frustrating for the staff, but it also puts the students in this very, very segmented space. And I think that for me, one of the things, the gifts of LCT is that where the knowledge is segmental, or the curriculum is segmental, we develop the cumulative learning is in the knower building, and that I think is just amazing, because we've got to find ways to help the students see how the parts fit together to make a whole, to inform the practice. I think that's just absolutely key.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really, really superb discussion here. Fascinating. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much. Okay, Natalie, are you?
Yeah, I was just going to draw from what Lee was saying and your point about assessment. Just that I think if you are finding those NOAA values as legitimate and valued by academics, how do they translate into assessment? And was that a question that you asked in your interviews? So when you asked about what was value, did you follow that up with how does this relate to assessment?
Yeah, I did. And especially, you know, the people who were talking about the theory and the close reading could articulate relatively, you know, how this is assessed. But you know, another problem at UNISA is because it's massive. We have 10,000 first-year students, so our marking is outsourced. So even that causes all kinds of craziness with, you know, the people who are trying to develop the gaze are not necessarily the people who are going to be assessing. But I think there is, you know, with these like essays where students are supposed to reflect critically and engage with the literary text, I think to some extent we are managing to assess the close reading skills. But when it comes to like whether you are actually broadening your horizons in terms of cultural diversity and that kind of thing is, I think like the approach tends to be, we hope that students kind of pick up on those things themselves when they read the texts, you know, and we don't know if it's actually happening or not.
Yeah, I think that'd be really interesting to see if there was any alignment in kind of assessment rubrics with the cultivated gaze dispositions, and if there was any way that you could assess that in a tangible way, because it is all very intangible, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was part of also, you know, what led me to LCT was this, you know, people talk about assessment in such strange metaphorical ways in our department. You know, they'll be like, you need to squeeze the poem for more honey. Like that's like a comment that I got on one of my honors papers. You know, the text is like a honeycomb that needs to be squeezed. And I'm like, what on earth, you know? So to try and find a more explicit way of talking about these things and getting lecturers to also see whether they are actually talking about the same things or not when they are kind of referring to these vague things like, you know, like close reading or critical thinking doesn't necessarily actually mean the same thing to all of the lecturers. So yeah, so thanks, Natalie. Anything else for either for Yanae or Tanusha as well? I see we've got like 1 minute and then we're done. Thanks so much, everyone. This has been really great. I've really enjoyed engaging with all of you, and thank you for all of your comments. I'm going to save the chat as well so that I can look at them in more detail later.